All right, welcome to the third and final video of our lecture about the grid and renewables. We'll call this one Renewables versus the grid. In the first two videos, we talked about how the grid developed, how it works, at least how it used to work. But now we've got renewables entering the scene, and there are a few things about them we need to understand. First, some renewables, specifically solar plus wind, are intermittent, and we know this. But it's important to state here because this is why this is a problem, because something like solar is going to peak at noon. And depending on the time of year, solar is going to drop completely off the grid, anywhere from more like 4:30 to 9 o'clock p.m., depending on where you are and what time of year. And it drops out very rapidly, especially on a very clear day. Okay. Here's another problem, is the utility can't control distributed generation. So all of those solar panels out on people's rooftops generating power, in this case almost always excess power in the daylight hours, must be sold back to the grid, aka the utility company, and they have to figure out what to do with it because they can't control it. It's just given to them. A utility controlled renewable, so a large field of solar panels or a wind farm, when the output of the renewables exceeds the power that they need, then they are going to curtail that power, or essentially just not use it. It is wasted. And what this does is it increases the payoff time, because that energy you could have had and used and sold is not used but wasted. And yeah, we'll talk more about how that works here in a second. So let's look at the impact of renewables on the demand and supply curve. So here we have in California the hourly electric load versus the load without solar and wind. So here the blue curve is the total demand on the curve. The solar output is down here in gray. As expected, it's nothing at nighttime. This is October 22nd, and so around 7 or 8 p.m., the a.m., the sun comes up, and it sets, so about 6 o'clock, almost at 7, peaking a little later in the afternoon. So that's great, but the problem is, if we take this blue curve and we subtract this gray curve, we get this orange curve, right? This is what we've come to call the duck curve, because it supposedly looks like a duck. Here's the beak, and here's the duck and its tail. That's not bad, right? There's the duck. So see that the curve of the orange follows that shape of that duck. Let's erase that. That's just embarrassing. Okay, and this is a problem because base generation plus mid-merit generation. So the power plants we've already built in order to meet this demand are already there, and they need to go, and they work most efficiently if they're just allowed to run continuously. So let's say our base load is here, so we can leave those power plants running, but then, let's say here in the morning we turn on our mid-merit generators, but then suddenly we get duck curved. So those mid-merit generators, what do? Do we turn them off? But we can't really turn them all the way off because we still need to fill this power. So do we? You see, we kind of have this issue. Then we have another problem in that we have this sudden ramp up. The ramp up happens when solar goes down fast, right? So right here is where we see a fairly sudden, quick decrease in solar, but demand increases. So they're doing opposite things. The demand in this same time period is about to hit its peak right when solar drops out, which means not only do we have to bring on our mid-merit generation almost all at once again, but we also need to turn on our peaking plants probably a bit more rapidly than we want to. This curve was first brought to our attention actually by a regional California manager who said, hey, we're having this problem in the spring and the fall with trying to adopt to the power output of solar panels. Now, we've managed it. Obviously, they're not having huge blackouts in California, but, oh dear, that word did not work. As renewables gain market share, then the duck curve gets worse. I'll show you what I mean. So here's the real duck curve on March 31st in California. This is in 2012. And then look at this, 2013, it's almost completely flattened out. And then this is projected, of course. But as we go further and further down, as we add more and more, then we're going to have overgeneration, because at some point we're going to start dipping into even our base load. And those you don't just turn off, they have to keep going. So we will have overgeneration, which means that the solar panels will be curtailed. And we do not want that. That would ruin the ability to really deploy solar panels on a large scale. Likewise, look at this ramp. How are you supposed to turn on between, what is that, a 2-hour period going from 14,000 to 26,000? You're almost doubling your need in 2 hours. That is a real challenge. So this duck curve right here, this is the main threat to renewable energy, I believe, as it stands now. So what can we do about it? Fighting the duck curve. All right, so the first thing you've probably heard of is the smart grid, which is a concept, not really a thing. People are like, we need to build the smart grid. I say, well, tell me where and I'll get a shovel and dig a hole. But really, we just mean we need to upgrade the grid with some things, some protocols, some understandings. One of the first things, there's a few definitions of what it means to have a smart grid, built kind of organized into topics. The first topic almost always is, excuse me, communication between something consuming power, so a power consuming device, and the technology generating power, right? If we let them lead blind as two different things in two different rooms, just making power and just using power, then we're going to have this big duck curve problem. But if we can make them communicate, that is the first most important thing. Then we can attempt an optimization of our supply and demand. So this could be, well, what power plants do we turn on now? What power plants do we turn on in the future? What power plants should we turn off? Relating to this, part of the smart grid is forecasting, or predicting both demand and output. Back in the day, predicting output was easy. You just made the output because we had total control. But with solar, wind, etc., there's less control. You have to predict what your actual output will be and somehow try to make that fit demand, and then optimize what power plants you use based on that predicted demand, and then adjust based on what's actually happening. Okay. We also are looking at real-time load control. So until now, this load curve that we've looked at, this blue curve right here, has been the gospel. You do not mess with the load curve, except for today, especially in peaking hours, a controller can turn off a factory. So if we're having a real problem with peaking and we're going to go into a brownout or the frequency will go too low, then the load controller, the grid control, will actually call the guy running the giant car factory and say, listen, you need to shut down for an hour. And they will shut down because they have to. Okay, so it's like that, but for everyone. So this would be turning off a factory, but also turn off your washing machine. And turn off your AC temporarily. Turn off your dishwasher. Just anything that is using a lot of power all at once at 5 o'clock. The ability to feather that. So to make your washing machine turn off just for 5 minutes, then resume its cycle. Make your AC stop 20 seconds before it would have stopped. Make your dishwasher wait a couple minutes. So now real-time load control, not just turning on and off power plants, but turning on and off the things that are using that power. And make all of this smart. In other words, the devices are controlling themselves. There's no human interaction here. Finally, we also have some ideas for advanced small-scale storage. So if we have a lot of excess power, we don't have to get rid of it. We could store it somewhere. Well, the question is, where do you store it? Well, what about inside of people's hybrid electric vehicles? We talked about getting a big bank of batteries we can use to store energy. Well, we have electric cars. Aren't those a big bank of batteries? So store it using the batteries of cars as storage for the grid, or even using a thing called thermal AC, where you use kind of phase change material in an AC in order to store thermal energy, which you can then use later either to reject heat or to put heat into your home. Okay, so that's our first tool, the smart grid. There's a lot of research going on there, but it's complicated. A less complicated idea that we'll need both of these undoubtedly, but energy storage. So, I mean, it's very simple, right? We just store excess energy when production is greater than demand. And then we release that energy when we have the opposite situation. Our demand is greater than our production. And the great thing about this is it flattens the production curve. So we're able to have a more constant production rate, which means we can have more large power plants or more fluctuating power plants that operate with renewable sources, or larger power plants that use a consumable fuel but operate more efficiently. So here's the idea, right? Let's look at this black line kind of inside this red line. That represents the load. Now, typically what we've done is we have generated power with no energy storage following the load exactly like this red line follows this black line exactly. But if we say, all right, instead we're just going to generate green line, a constant amount of power at all times using some giant nuclear power plant, then what we say is we take black curve minus green curve. And we say right now, oh, look, we have a surplus of power. We're going to store that in some sort of material. For now, it will be a black box storage. When we have this scenario, a positive surplus, we put that energy into storage. Then, when the amount of power that we need is above what we're generating, we pull that energy out of storage and utilize it here. And then again, once we are in a surplus, we add to the storage. Really a very simple idea that makes a lot of sense. This allows us, say this was our If we didn't have storage, we would have to have this amount of generation capability, which we might or might not be able to turn off and therefore operate less efficiently. Here we can operate very efficiently, and although we can't meet peak demands, if we have storage, we can stay on top of things. Okay, this is just a kind of more accurate look at how it would look. So here's a typical demand curve. And the reason I put this here is I wanted to show that this storage will be used here to meet peak demands. So the real benefit of storage is it could eliminate peaking power plants, which are the least efficient, and therefore the ones we want to get rid of the most. Okay, we're going to talk about storage in our next lecture, specifically batteries and pump storage, my personal favorite, and then flywheels. We're going to talk about those three things next lecture. Okay, thanks for watching.